Let's compare cup-hilt rapiers with swept-hilt rapiers. Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. Now we're going to be looking at rapiers in this video, and this type of rapier, known as a cup-hilt rapier, particularly found in Spain and Portugal and Italy in the 17th century, and I'll come back to details about that, is a particularly kind of iconic style of rapier that we find in lots of movies. But historically, swept-hilt rapiers were pretty much more common, and certainly the main type of rapier in the 16th century. So this raises lots of questions about why cup-hilt rapiers are so popular in certain styles of fencing, and so popular in modern movies, and also in modern HEMA practice as well, and why we don't see more swept-hilt rapiers when these were numerically more common in history. Does one offer advantages over the other? Well, yes, they each have advantages, and we're going to look at those points in this video. And this video, incidentally, is sponsored by established titles, but more about that later. Now, before we get into the pluses and minuses of each of these designs, I just want to deal with a few misconceptions. First of all, what is a rapier? Well, very simply, and keeping it very brief because it would be a whole video by itself to deal with it properly, this is a rapier, and this is a rapier, and lots of other types of swords are rapiers as well. Lots of people would say that they developed into the small sword, but notice that this is a double-edged cutting blade, so it's not a typical triangular bladed small sword. And this was known as the small sword, which appears around the middle of the 17th century, particularly later 17th century, so we're talking about late 1600s, mid to late 1600s. And these are called small swords because proportionately they are shorter, smaller and lighter than the rapiers that went before them, and indeed which were contemporary. And in fact, if I just put the swept hilt down for a second, the cup hilts remain around until the 1700s, well into the 1700s, in some cases up until 1800. So these are contemporaries, and you can see why therefore this is called a small sword, because it is smaller than a rapier. But just to confuse matters, some fencing treatises refer to these as rapiers, and no doubt the fencing methods, we know that the fencing methods for small sword are closely related to late rapier fencing methods. But fundamentally, to most modern people, a rapier is a fairly long and fairly heavy, it has to be said. This is 1240 grams. The cup hilt here is closer to 1100 grams, whereas a small sword is merely around 650 grams. So the small sword is a lot lighter. But these swept hilt rapiers with long thrust-centric blades essentially stem from earlier swept hilt or developed hilt swords that we would commonly now call side swords. Now, side sword, or in Italian spada da lato, is not really a historical term. Spada da lato literally means a sword you wear at your side, so it can mean basically any kind of arming sword essentially. But you'll notice there's some basic similarities. These are both swept hilts, and these are both hilts which could be found, or at least similar hilts to this could be found in the 16th century. Now, funnily enough, this is actually a replica of one in the Wallace collection, which is a 17th century sword. But putting that aside, this style of hilt basically was around since the 16th century. And indeed, this is a replica of a sword, which is of a 16th century type. So when we're looking at earlier rapier systems, we find swept hilts, and really the famous cup hilt doesn't really come around until the 17th century, and for the most part cup hilts don't really become common until about 1630s, 1640s. And it's also important to state that there weren't only cup hilts and swept hilts. There are a whole bunch of other kinds of hilts as well. For example, Pappenheimers, shell hilts, various other closed port ring hilts, 7-ring sort of swept hilts, cup hilt hybrids. There's everything in between. So in a way, with rapier hilts, we sort of have simple forms of swept hilt at one end, cup hilts at the other end, and we've got everything in between. And in many cases, the various form of cup and shell hilt, which appear in places like England or the Netherlands or Germany, Pappenheimers and things like this, they do kind of fall between these two in terms of the pluses and the minuses that we're going to look at here. And I also just briefly want to mention that we absolutely should not confuse a cup hilt rapier with a fencing épée. They are very, very different beasts. And whilst superficially to someone on a movie set, they might look like similar objects because they've got a large bowl for a handguard and they've got long, straight, relatively narrow blades. These are exceptionally different in the hand. The main point is weight, okay? So rapiers are, not only are they much longer as well, if I just put them down on the ground, so the épée comes up to about my belt line, and the rapier in this case comes up to about almost the bottom of my sternum. So the rapier is much longer and much heavier. This is 1100 and something grams, if I remember correctly, yes, around 1100 grams, and this one is only about 500 grams. Even in the way we use them, the épée is purely a thrusting implement. The épée de combat was used for first blood dueling in France in the 19th century. The rapier, even the quite narrow ones, the systems for their use do give cuts with a moulinet, with a circular motion. They might not be cleaving cuts like we might get from a sabre or a langmesser, but nevertheless they can cut and they do have edges. Now, wearing a rapier or any other kind of fancy sword in the 17th century was often a sign of being a gentleman. And indeed, if you want to be a lord or lady, then you should check out Established Titles. Thanks to Established Titles and this fancy proclamation here, you can now refer to me as Laird Easton. It goes by an old Scottish principle whereby if you own land in Scotland, you can refer to yourself as Laird or Lady of that land. In this case, that means the purchase of at least 1 square foot of land on a private estate in Eddleston in Scotland. Amazingly, Established Titles have just let me know that the people using my link, my landing page linked below, the first 200 will get plots next to mine, which will be like forming our own Schola Gladiatoria clan. Your certificate will have an exact plot number like mine, so you'll be able to see exactly where your land is. And with every order, Established Titles also promise to plant a tree, which obviously helps the environment and everything else. Established Titles works closely with the charities One Tree Planted and Trees for the Future. Established Titles is actually running a massive sale right now, and you can get an extra 10% off if you use my special and unique code SG10. So you can take advantage of that offer right now by going to establishedtitles.com/SG10 to take advantage of this. Or of course, check out the link right below in the description box there. And thanks again to Established Titles for sponsoring this video. So let's get back to the question here of swept-hilt rapier versus cup-hilt rapier. Now, as mentioned, these went on to become or be replaced by small swords, ultimately in the 18th century. For the most part, although, as I say, cup-hilts did stay around in Spain for quite a long time and parts of Latin America. And they came from, we could loosely say, side swords or developed hilted cut and thrust swords. So, however, in the middle here we have a period in the 16th and 17th centuries when the rapier was one of the absolute most common sidearms carried in civilian dueling, but also in military life as well. And I think a lot of people have the misconception these are only civilian dueling swords as used by the Three Musketeers, but they were absolutely also carried in war by soldiers, both on horse and on foot. So let's have a little look. What are some of the pluses and minuses of swept hilts versus cup hilts? And why doesn't everyone just use one or the other? So the first thing to consider perhaps is strength, okay? Now, what's interesting, I think, is that from a mechanical point of view, the circle or dome seems like a very, very strong structure. However, you have to bear in mind that you can't make this cup or bowl, you can't make it incredibly thick because that would make it incredibly heavy. It is, at the end of the day, a large, solid plate. Whereas this is a series of bars. So when we come to strength and being crushed by a blow, for example, if someone swung something like a two-handed sword, a montante, or even a type of polearm like a halberd or something like that at you, then in defending, if this hilt got struck by one of those things, or indeed if you fell off a horse and landed on the sword, then very often what we find is with swept hilts that are made up of bars, the bars individually can be made thicker than you can make an entire bowl. So if you actually look at antique versions of the cup hilt here, and very often they're perforated to try and make them lighter as well, but they're often not especially thick steel. And in fact, even if we look at the cup hilts used in modern HEMA use, these cups do get dented and bashed and squashed sometimes. So, Bars can be thicker and therefore more resistant to crushing, you could argue. But we also have to bear in mind, as I've said already in this video, there are swords that come between these two. There are things like Pappenheimer hilts and forms of shell hilt, clamshell hilts and things like this, which have some of the benefits of one and some of the benefits of the other. So it's not always an either or, sometimes there's a middle ground between the two. But overall, we could say that the bars on a swept hilt are very often thicker and more robust than they are sometimes on a cup-hilted rapier. Now, the equal and next, perhaps most obvious point is one of coverage. Most people point out that the cup hilt, particularly when the weapons are presented point forward, provides more hand protection, or it seems to. So this is one of the reasons that in modern HEMA practice, even people who aren't doing Spanish rapier or aren't doing styles of Italian rapier which used cup hilts, even if they're doing systems that according to the sources used swept hilts, they often use a cup hilt. Now, coverage is a very, very interesting thing. There are lots of different angles and ways to look at this. Firstly, if we look at the most obvious way, straight forwards. So quillons up or quillons sideways, and you'll notice that cup hilts often have quite long quillons on them, but sometimes so do swept hilts. You'll notice frontally, the hand and indeed some of my forearm and wrist is hidden completely behind a cup, which obviously is really, really cool. And not only do you hide the hand and the arm behind it, but you can also hide parts of the body behind it because it's far away, and via, if you imagine a cone of defense, if you imagine shining a light past this and imagine the shadow it would cast on the wall behind me, you're actually getting quite a lot of angulation of defense so long as the point is forwards. Now, if we bring the point offline for some reason, say for example someone cuts at my head, there's a few ways of dealing with that. One could be to actually just put the hilt up and leave the point online. But if for whatever reason, if we're doing a cut or anything like this, if for some reason we bring the sword sideways, you'll notice that the cup still provides quite a lot of protection. However, I do start to show my hand at the side, and that is why we have a knuckle bow. Now, what's interesting to note is that when we look at swept hilt guards like this, not always, and not really in this case, but in some of them, we have bars that come further around the side of the hand. Now, there might be a correlation there with use, and these two things have to be spoken about in unison, okay? Because it's very notable that cup hilts were popular in Spain with certain styles of fencing which keep the arm quite extended and keep the point forward, okay? If you are fencing in a style of rapier from Italy, for example, or France, where the hand is kept lower down here, then clearly the cup hilt isn't necessarily so relevant in that situation because the hand is now down. So in that case, if the hand is presented at an angle, at a slant, then these sidebars and this side protection might become more important. Now, if you have sidebars, because they're important to your style of fencing, then due to weight and other considerations, it might be that you don't want a cup at the top, because that would be adding too much weight to the sword. That being said, if we look at certain types of sword which come between the swept hilt and the cup hilt, things like the Pappenheimer and certain types of English shell hilt, then sometimes we see a combination. Sometimes we see a cup with some sidebars or with lower reinforcing bars as well. As always with all swords, the more you add to them, the heavier the hilt might become, or the more fragile you have to make the hilt to cover a wider area without making it heavier. So it's always a trade-off. You add more stuff, you have to think about how to make it lighter so it doesn't become too heavy, or you just accept it does become heavier, and that gives you other disadvantages. So you can't just keep adding things and always gain, gain, gain. You always lose something. So you'll notice that these offer different levels of coverage. Now, if I was using a swept hilt with Spanish destreza fencing, for example, and my hand was presented forwards all the time, then a swept hilt, although they were used, absolutely might not be my optimum choice because, of course, I've got openings to the hand from the opponent's point. Okay, so it's all really about what angles you want to prioritize in terms of coverage with this particular style of sword, whether it's more of a cut and thrust sword, whether it's more of a point centric, you know, maybe let's say 100% or 95% thrust, or whether it's maybe 80% thrust to 20% cut, and how those balance out, what guard positions you use in the system that you practice, in the area that you're living in and stuff like that. They make a difference as to which of these hilts is going to make more sense. And as I say, the compromise hilts between these two that have some of the advantages of a cup and some of the advantages of a swept hilt, if those make more sense indeed. But remember, weight is always a part of this as well. So fundamentally, in most cases, a cup hilt does protect the hand more. And oh, one other thing that's important to mention is how many fingers you put over the quillon. In fact, I use the swept hilt for this because it's clearer to see. Usually, and certainly I think in the earliest point of rapier development, it was conventional to put only the index finger over the guard. Okay, however, you can put 2 fingers over the guard. Doesn't make an awful lot of sense with this sword. However, you'll notice that many cup hilts have exceedingly short grips, and that's because only 2 fingers are going around the grip and 2 fingers are going inside the bowl. And when you do that, the hand is basically disappearing inside the bowl. So you've almost got a bowl right the way around the hand. So you gain an awful lot of hand protection because you've got 2 fingers over the guard. But having 2 fingers over the guard does somewhat change how the sword moves and what you're able to do with it. Personally, I find it's not so convenient for cutting, but it does give you more point control for thrusting. So it all comes back down to what style of fencing are you doing, what style of hilt is going to work with those guard positions and that manner of using the sword. The other point to bear in mind, and not necessarily saying that it's superior, is that fundamentally the cup hilt here is just a later design. It doesn't appear until really, you know, well after 1600. Cup hilt rapiers don't really become common until about 1640, 1650. And in fact, they're still in use, as I say, in the 1700s. Whereas the swept hilt first appears way back early. I mean, obviously on side swords, but it appears earlier in the 1500s. So in a sense, it is worth mentioning for anyone who's not clear on this, that fundamentally this is a later style of hilt than this. It is technologically further along. However, that being said, also that these did stay around in use. This example from the Wallace collections from about 1630, 1640. So that would have been in use at the same time as this, even though that this would be a more old-fashioned design, should we say, or rather old-fashioned type of sword than the cup hilt, which didn't appear until later. Now, another point that I think some people would be thinking about is ease of wear. A big point that I make in lots of my videos over the years is that swords aren't all about fighting. Very often they're about wearing. They are sidearms. That is, you wear them at your side, like a pistol, like a knife. And they have to be convenient, because the thing that you can wear around all the time and you almost forget it's there is a more useful sidearm than something that is a massive pain in the butt and you're always removing it because it's inconvenient. If you're always removing it, it's not going to be there when you need it. So absolutely, swords, you know, the length of their hilts, their mass, the length of their blades, the length of their crossguards, all of these things can be dictated by ease of wear. It's not always about what's most effective once it's in your hand and you're having a fight. Because let's face it, most swords in history never actually got used to fight with. Most swords in history were just worn around as a deterrent, self-defense, or as a symbolic sort of representation of your status and things like this, which we'll come back to in a second. Now, a lot of people would say, well, the cup hilt is considerably more inconvenient to wear than a swept hilt because it takes up more lateral space and is going to get in the way. I actually don't think that's a major point. It might be a very slight point, but I don't think it's a major point for 2 main reasons. Firstly, if you look at the area taken up by the cup and you look at the area taken up by the swept hilt, whilst the swept hilt is asymmetrical, and we'll come back to that as well in a second, it does nevertheless project at the sides. You've got the inner guard and the outer guard, just the same as you have on the cup. So they both take up lateral space. Now, I have to admit that the swept hilt in most cases, maybe not all guards, but in most cases, does take up slightly less space on the inside, much like a lot of military saber hilts. So it's less likely to bash against you on the inside line. However, there is a major reason why both these things are just not really a major point, and that is the way that the rapier is worn. Because of the length of the blade, the rapier is not worn up here against your body because you wouldn't be able to draw it. If I just use my hand as a makeshift scabbard, their blades are long enough that you wouldn't be able to quickly draw the weapon and defend yourself or attack or whatever if the weapon was worn that high. For that reason, they are worn down low and they are worn almost horizontal. They're usually about that angle. So that being the case, the hilt is actually in front of your body. So the hilt isn't against you anyway. It's not like a katana or wakizashi, or indeed certain types of medieval sword, like a langmesser, for example. They're not against your body in the same way. They are worn much like sabers, usually anyway. They are worn almost horizontal with the hilt in front of the body. So yes, indeed, their length is an inconvenience, and we know that this was complained about in various courts of the 16th and 17th centuries, the length of blades and the size of swords, because they were a nuisance in the court and all this, or in the street even as well, because of people whacking each other with their scabbards and sometimes even hilts. But the fact is that in terms of the size of the hilt, it's not really a problem, because your cup hilt can have whatever length quillons and whatever size cup you like, and because it's being worn down here, it just doesn't really get in the way. The length of the blade is more of a problem than the size of the hilt. So convenience of wear, I think, is really a non-point. They're equal. One doesn't have an advantage over the other. Now, I did say I was going to talk just for a second about symmetry and asymmetry. One of the interesting things about the cup hilt specifically is that it is completely symmetrical. Now, what's interesting is you might not think that that's a big thing, but I'll tell you, when you're changing the orientation of the blade, and particularly in Spanish systems, well, basically all systems, the cross guard, which you can see here is very, very long, can be really important in defense, because if my sword is here and a thrust comes in under here, I can actually divert the opponent's blade. I could do it with the base of my blade, but you can do it with the quillon and still leave the point on line to counter thrust back at them. Now, what's interesting is when you turn this sword, it feels almost like a propeller. It's absolutely symmetrical. You feel no resistance whatsoever, which is a very interesting thing, because I can change from my hand being in pronation, as it's called, to supination. In other words, from terse to cart, with no resistance and no hindrance whatsoever. And that drastically changes the angles that I can attack or defend easily based on which direction my hand is in. Okay, so being able to turn the sword unhindered is a very interesting point. Now, when we come to the swept hilt, you'll notice this is not a symmetrical hilt at all. It actually projects far further on the outside line, because when you hold a sword, more of your hand is on one side of the grip than the other. So just as with sabers, often, just grab one here, just as with sabers, often the hilt projects more on one side than the other for the exact same reason. However, that does mean that when I turn it, I do feel a little bit more resistance, despite the fact that this has got shorter quillons and I should be feeling less inertia. This is actually probably a heavier hilt than the other sword because the bars are thicker, and it doesn't feel as symmetrical when I turn it as the cup hilt does. So, not to say anything really more in depth about that, but it is interesting to note that an asymmetrical hilt, you can feel it and you feel some kind of resistance. That being said, there are swept hilts which are more symmetrical than this one, and as always there are hilts like Pappenheimers and English dish hilts and stuff that do, and shell hilts that come kind of between these two, and they very often, not always, but they very often are symmetrical. So really this isn't a cup hilt versus swept hilt thing. This is more of some hilts are symmetrical, some hilts are not symmetrical. And whilst the asymmetrical ones might have some advantage in saving some weight, perhaps sometimes being more convenient to wear, though I'm not sure about that, the symmetrical hilts, I think, have an advantage in the way they move in the hand. Now, the final point I'm going to address in this video of cup hilt versus swept hilt, and why did the swept hilt stay around and forms of swept hilts stay around even though the cup hilt was invented. If we look at modern HEMA, as I've said, you might think the cup hilt is the ultimate design because it's so popular in modern rapier practice. I think that's partly an artifact of the type of sport that we practice today. However, as I say, we know that swept hilts stayed around. Why did swept hilts and related hilts stay around if they offer less hand protection? Well, this is a difficult point to articulate, but I'm going to loosely title it style. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, the fact is we know that in the 16th and 17th centuries, rapiers were absolutely subjected to some of the highest forms of metalworking decoration that we know of in Europe at that time. And the fact is that, number one, rapiers and swords were expected to look a certain way for certain reasons of fashion and what you were trying to show. So first of all, it can simply be because a person preferred the look of this to the look of this. That's the first thing. And it might be because the decorative effects that they wanted to have on their hilt were better done on the bars that we might find on various forms of swept hilt, or in some cases the swords that come in between these two, like Pappenheimers and English dish hilts and things like this. It might be that they just preferred the look of it, or they looked more what they wanted the decoration to be, or, and this is the other point which I think often gets overlooked, nationalism. That's right, you weren't expecting that one, were you? So, how to explain? In the 17th century, so I won't say that it was the beginning of national identity in Europe. However, it's very, very clear that there were styles of fashion, and yes, styles of sword, which absolutely and inextricably are connected to certain areas. The fact is that there are similarities between, there are certain types of sword which you find in England. Yes, indeed, someone from outside England could buy one, but there are certain styles of rapier hilt or mortuary hilt, you know, basket hilted broadswords that you only find in Britain, basically. There are some that are English, some that are Scottish, but you only find them in Britain. Equally, there are certain styles of rapier, the cup hilt, which inextricably are connected to the Iberian Peninsula, that is Spain and Portugal, and they appear in Italy. However, in case you weren't aware, the whole south of Italy was very much under Spanish influence, as was the Netherlands. So, and that's the other place we find cup hilts. So because of the Spanish Empire, Spain, Portugal, some of the Netherlands, Flanders, and southern Italy were under Spanish influence, and the Spanish court was very influential. And of course, this relates to Latin America as well. So the fact is that these swords absolutely implied certain things about your political or cultural allegiances or influences. So that's where you'd find these swords. Now, contrary to this, who were the enemies of Spain at this time? Well, one of them was England. England was a huge rival in the Elizabethan period of Spain, and therefore probably inherently didn't really want to use rapiers that looked too Spanish. And so we do find forms of cup hilt in England, but they are a distinctively English style. So in protective terms and in function, they're very similar, but they tend to have slightly broader blades, usually more like this, there are differences to the hilt design. Equally, the Pappenheimer is a very German style, and then we find early forms of small sword start to appear, particularly in France, it's most famous for, but we also find them in Germany, and then they kind of spread everywhere. So very often the cup hilt rapier is stereotypically seen as a Spanish thing. The small sword is seen as a French thing, even if lots of other people copied it. And the swept hilt and various other forms of multi-barred hilts are seen as an Italian thing, and then things like the Pappenheimer are seen as a German thing. Equally, if we go to the Low Countries and England, we see forms of transitional rapier, which are essentially a sort of dish hilt. They're not exactly a a cup hilt, but they have a flatter, shallower dish. And these are typically found in England and the Netherlands and Flanders, the Low Countries, and Germany to some extent, northern Germany. And there are forms of double shell guard as well, which are found in Italy. Well, they're actually found all over Europe, in fairness. So, nationalism, national identity, I think is partially wrapped up in this. Politics, style, fashion. I'm just going to call this style, okay? But I think it is a massively overlooked part, and you have to remember that in some cases, you know, Oliver Cromwell's a good example, people who wore a rapier at court or around the streets didn't necessarily wear a rapier to war. Some people, like Cromwell, carried a basket-hilted broadsword to war, a mortuary hilt or whatever. So they might have a sword for town, something more like this in this case, which dates to about 1630, the original, and then a sword for war, and they might be different swords, and they might own multiple swords for different occasions. So absolutely, style, I think, was important. So I hope that's been thought-provoking. I'd be really interested to see your comments and thoughts. I am not a rapier specialist by any terms. If you want to learn more about rapiers, incidentally, the Bible and the book that I would really recommend is The Rapier and Small Sword, 1460 to 1820, by A.V.B. Norman. And this is a really seminal work and goes through all of the types of rapiers, well, side swords actually it starts out at, and you know, early complex hilted swords, and goes all the way through all of the developments, all the different pommels and guards and everything else, all the way through to small swords. So it's a very complex topic, and people are continually learning more about it. Luckily, there are actually loads of surviving rapiers out there in the world in museums, if places like the Wallace Collection and the Royal Armouries, or if you go to Vienna or you go to Musée de l'Armure in Paris, or various collections like the Stibert in Italy, in Florence, there are huge numbers of rapiers surviving. So it's a very complex topic, but also with a massive data set, unlike medieval swords, which not a huge number survive of. So we've got tons of original rapiers surviving. It's a very complex topic, a very interesting topic, and one that I think doesn't get enough attention. Anyway, I hope this has been interesting. If you disagree with anything I said, or you want to add to something I said, as always, you're very welcome to post below. And please share this video around, give us a like, make sure you're subscribed, and if you're interested in the sponsors and established titles list, then check out that link below. Thanks a lot for watching. I am Matt Easton, and I will continue to be. Cheers, folks.
Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.